Afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today and to welcome you all to Georgetown University. We're privileged to be hosting this two-day symposium on the future of the Asia Pacific with our fellow Jesuit institution, Sophia University of Japan. This is a topic of great importance as we consider the strong cultural and economic ties between the United States and Japan, and as we explore new opportunities for cooperation in the region through our conversations in these coming days. I wish to begin our program this afternoon by thanking all of our colleagues at Sophia, particularly the Chancellor, Father Toshiaki Koso of the Society of Jesus, and President Tadashi Takizawa, for everything that they have done to make these 2 days possible, for their leadership, and for helping to bring us all together. We're honored to begin our conversation today with a lecture by one of our distinguished public servants, Senator Tom Daschle. Senator Daschle, we're deeply grateful to you for your presence here today. The title of Senator Daschle's talk, Youth and Public Service in a Global Era, has deep resonance with the values and tradition upon which both Georgetown and Sophia were founded. As universities, we seek to provide our students an environment in which they can become their most authentic, become their very best selves, and to help each of them to acquire the knowledge, the habits of mind, the compassion that is necessary to becoming deeply caring, engaged, and committed members of our societies. One of the ways in which we talk about this goal is with a Jesuit phrase that you may have seen on banners around this campus. It's a phrase at the foundation of both Sophia and Georgetown's missions: women and men for others. Now, this phrase comes from an address made by Father Pedro Arrupe, the Superior General of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983, a man whom many consider to be the second founder of the Society of Jesus. He helped to reorient the mission of the order as one in which faith and justice are inextricable. And it's because of him that we find ourselves called to deeply engage in the world, to open ourselves to the horizons of others, to reach out in solidarity to our neighbors in need. In short, to be women and men for and with others. One of the great forms such service can take, such engagement can take, is public service. And never have our nations, our world needed compassionate, creative, and committed public servants as much as we do today. And it's because of this that we are deeply grateful to Senator Daschle for joining us this afternoon and for offering his reflections on this important topic. Following the talk, Professor Tom Banchoff, our Vice President for Global Engagement, will moderate a question and answer session with all of you. Before we hear from the Senator, however, it's my privilege to introduce to you Ambassador Ichiro Fujisaki. Ambassador Fujisaki served as the Japanese ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2012, and during those years became a much beloved member of the Washington community. His ties to the United States date back to his childhood when he attended junior high school in Seattle, and then as a young adult when he studied at both Brown and Stanford. In the late 1990s, he came to Washington as the political minister of the Embassy of Japan. Prior to serving as ambassador to the U.S., he was ambassador to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in Geneva, where he served as the chairman of the Executive Committee of the UN High Commission for Refugees. He's also held the position of Deputy Foreign Minister of Japan and was appointed the personal representative of the Japanese Prime Minister to G8 summit meetings. At the conclusion of his distinguished diplomatic career, he joined the Academy and is currently professor and chairman of international strategies at Sophia. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Ambassador Fujisaki.
Thank you very much, President DeGioia, for a very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so nice to see you all for this centennial celebration of Sophia University. We are grateful that Georgetown is organizing this with us. And the keynote speaker, very special. We have Senator Tom Daschle. He is really a man who needs no introduction. Sometimes we say that and go on to explain for 15 minutes because someone needs introduction. But you all know him, that he's a man of big, warm heart, high intellectual, strong leadership. But I think he's outstanding because of his humility, down-to-earth attitude. After he speaks, he's ready to get any answers, any questions, I'm sorry, on Syria, on education, on any issues. And we are all here to listen to him and learn from him. So I would like to have Senator Daschle. Tom, please.
Ichiro, thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction. I am very grateful to you, not only for your friendship, but for the extraordinary contribution that you have made to the relationship between our countries for so long. Your commitment as ambassador and as leader has made a significant impact on this relationship for a long time now. And so it is a real honor for me to be introduced by you and to call you a friend. President DeGioia, let me say how pleased I am to be back on Georgetown's campus. I have an enormous amount of admiration for the quality of education that is offered here each and every day. Occasionally, I have the good fortune to speak in classes here. And I must say, the only thing that exceeds the extremely impressive perception that I have of the university as I talk to students are the faculty members themselves. So I congratulate you on your leadership and your work, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some time with you today. Let me also say that I am pleased that Chancellor Koso and President Takizawa could be here as well. They have traveled a good distance to spend some time on this very, very special occasion. And what a special occasion it is. I asked the ambassador how often this conference takes place, and he said once every 100 years. As you know, Sophia is celebrating its centennial this year. Those students who may not be aware of that should know that this is the 100th anniversary of Sophia. And so there are many students from Sophia who are here. Would you mind raising your hand, the students from Sophia? Let us welcome them with a big round of applause. Thank you very much for traveling. But Sophia and Georgetown have had an extraordinarily successful partnership. And so it's indicative of that partnership and the relationship of the two very prominent universities that we would gather this afternoon to celebrate not only the partnership, but a centennial year of education. And I think it's true that you epitomize the relationship between our countries. Japan continues to be one of the most important allies and friends for the United States. Never so true than now. Just in the most recent days, with President Abe's comments about the administration's efforts in the Middle East, yet another indication of Japan's long-standing friendship and loyalty to this partnership and the friendship that we've enjoyed. And so I am very grateful to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about that relationship and our responsibilities within it today. Let me say how pleased I am as well, indicative of our appreciation of that friendship, that we would now have selected Caroline Kennedy to be our next ambassador to Japan. I have had the good fortune to know her for some time, and I can say without equivocation that she is the personification of public service in a global era, having committed her life not only here at home, but internationally to public service. And she will serve our country well and contribute mightily to an even stronger partnership and relationship in the years ahead. Her father, President Kennedy, was one of the most important and influential inspirations to me as I contemplated a life in public service. I had a teacher as I attended Sacred Heart School in Aberdeen, South Dakota, who had a significant influence on me in my life and in the early years. Her name was Sister Morris Crowley. She had a great sense of humor. She said she always wanted to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, and God made her a basilica instead. But Sister Morris brought in television sets as the campaign of 1960 unfolded. And for the first time, I was introduced to the American political process as a young student in school. And I still remember vividly the inauguration of 1960 as a young child. We watched the inauguration in class, and I can say, without any fear of contradiction, that as people my age look back over all of the inaugural addresses provided and given over the course of the last 60 years, I don't know that any will ever be more memorable than that one in particular. Literally millions of Americans were equally stirred as I was with those now famous words. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. John Shattuck, who was the CEO of the Kennedy Library for a long period of time, up until 2009, has told an important story about President Kennedy and the impact that he had on young people, perhaps even now, but certainly back then. It was October 14th of 1960. Then Senator Kennedy made a last stop in a grueling 18-hour campaign, arriving at the University of Michigan at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was absolutely convinced at 2 o'clock in the morning there would be no one there. But he arrived on campus, and lo and behold, there were 10,000 students who were still waiting to see him. 10,000 students who have been waiting over 6 hours for the opportunity to hear candidate Kennedy. Revived and moved by their enthusiasm, Senator Kennedy asked the students if they were willing to devote themselves to serving overseas. Their roar of approval persuaded him on the spot a new volunteer program, a program that would fire the imagination of generations of young Americans. It was 5 months later, in March of 1961, the new president signed an executive order creating what we now know today as the Peace Corps, and giving life to his inaugural call. Americans, young and old, answered that call by going to work in the African bush, in the slums of Latin America and in Asia, building roads, offering health care, teaching children. My brother Steve spent 2 years in Sierra Leone teaching improved farming methods. He had such an extraordinary experience, and it had such a profound effect on him that when he returned from Sierra Leone after 2 years, he entered the Kennedy School, got a master's degree in public administration at Harvard, and has now spent the last 25 years as CEO of the Center for Youth and Families in Seattle. In fact, in just 2 weeks, I'll be going there to celebrate his 25th anniversary. We were talking not long ago, and I asked him just what motivates him. What was it that motivated him to commit his life to public service for now a quarter of a century? He said it all started at the Peace Corps. It all started with President Kennedy's call to action, and it's still in my heart. Its example has inspired many other worthwhile initiatives for public service and community commitment, including the Volunteers in Service to America, we commonly call VISTA, AmeriCorps, Teach for America, all programs that had the same ideological and extraordinary impact on young people all over the world. But Ambassador Shattuck has made an observation in recent years that I think is as true today as when he said it a couple of years ago. He has argued that the Peace Corps, which symbolizes the patriotic call to public service and the challenge to Americans to engage in others to tackle our world's problems, today are in danger of being dramatically downsized. That those spirits of involvement and those commitments to public service may not be what they once were, in part because of what has happened over at least the last decade. As a result of an increasing but now long-standing drive in Washington to minimize the role of government, to limit our obligations around the world, we have now seen a diminution in some quarters and in some institutions and among some young about a commitment to public service. Government can always be streamlined. But over the last 25 years, especially over the last 10, it is commonplace to campaign against Washington to win the right to govern, ironically. And these cynical attacks have taken a toll on the willingness of young people to enter public service and produced a climate of suspicion and cynicism around both politics as well as public service today. Yet the need for your commitment has never been greater. We are experiencing arguably one of the most transformational times in all of civilized history. Equal in importance to post-Cold War and post-World War periods, the global community is evolving from an interdependence to an integration that is largely economically driven, and in part, I would say, significant part of that motivation and that economic evolution has occurred as a result of technology and travel, two of the most powerful forces we see in our economy today. We've seen virtually the death of distance with technology, the ability to communicate anywhere in the world almost instantaneously, visually and audibly. And that has brought about a rapid, a profound change in the interdependence and ultimately the integration of the world community. And you, younger generations, will be the prime beneficiaries and, unfortunately, primarily the victims of much of about what is to occur over the course of the next century. It is highly likely that a child born today will easily see life in the 22nd century as life expectancy improves. When one of my grandchildren was born, I'll never forget a comment made by a friend who said, "Our children are a future to a message that we will not see." And so it is. Each of you, as young adults and students, are a message to future generations that I certainly will not see. Cures will be found for some of the most terrible diseases in life. Access to new science, knowledge, and information will be enhanced even more than it is today. That's so easy to believe. The quality of life is likely to continue to improve for billions of people. All of that and so much more positive and exciting new influences on life will all be experienced by each of the people in this room today. But along with a more exciting and opportunistic world is a far more dangerous and uncertain one. Nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons will continue to proliferate. Some predict not if, but when these weapons will be used in a major urban center, and all one has to do is to look what has happened in Syria over the last few weeks to be reminded again of how critically important and urgent it is that the world community address this explosive potential for danger in new forms. This is certainly going to be an historic week in Washington, regardless of what happens, and I'm sure you'll have questions about the implications of the decisions to be made in Congress over the course of the next several days. I'll never forget, I was majority leader, and over the course of my time as leader, I had the good fortune to meet a lot of people and develop friendships, as I have with the Ambassador, that have lasted a long time. And one of the friendships that I had was with the speechwriter for President Kennedy, Ted Sorensen. He became a very important mentor and special friend. We were walking in the halls of Congress one day, and as we were walking, hearing our footsteps reverberate in these extraordinary and beautiful parts of history, he commented to me, "Senator Daschle, just remember that every day in ways large and small, you make and live history in this place." That is true of all of us, certainly here in Washington, but in ways large and small, we continue to make history, and we will as future generations unfold. Cyber threats with the potential to bring entire countries to total chaos pose equally as daunting a challenge as some of the chemical and biological weapons. And with 9+ billion people predicted to live in the world by the year 2050, we have to produce more food in the next 40 years than we did in the last 8,000. Just an enormously daunting realization. Climate change may pose the biggest single threat to society around the world because of its total global impact on the species of life. If you haven't seen the most recent issue of National Geographic, they have a map of the world projecting just what climate change could do if nothing changes. And believe it or not, according to the National Geographic and that particular map, Washington would be on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean by the end of this century. Whole countries would be underwater. Cities like New York and Miami, Shanghai, others all over the world no longer exist. Contagions of deadly disease pose enormous threats to the global population. and religious extremism has the potential to disrupt and destabilize vast regions of the world. Income disparity, with the chasm between the rich and the poor, continues to grow, adding greater pressure to societal order in both developed and developing nations. Some of these challenges will be addressed successfully by those in the private sector. And I applaud the determined entrepreneurs who are dedicated to addressing climate change and all of the other challenges that I've just laid out. We need their involvement and commitment. But I dare say that most of the challenges that I've just described cannot be addressed in the private sector alone. Most will require public policy solutions and public service, leadership and involvement. And the United States and the Japanese response, and even the global response, must be fully cognizant of these challenges and the need for public policy commitment and leadership. And it would be my hope that as our two countries in particular explore in both a proactive as well as a reactive way how we might address these circumstances, that we consider the 4D framework that I would hope that would be part of our response to the many, many challenges we face in the world as we consider, both optimistically as well as realistically, our future and the future of the next generation. My 4D framework is both an opportunity to think proactively as well as reactively to the circumstances we know are part of that future. The first of my 4Ds is defense, a realization that we will always be in need of international security. But it would be my hope that we could look at the first D, defense, in ways beyond the traditional context and definition. That security today must not only include our military services and a recognition of the importance of modern weaponry, but meaningful security also requires that we understand the complexities, the challenges, and the nuanced policy involving biological, chemical, and cyber warfare. And health contexts too, in both geophysical as well as the transnational religious world. Our challenges over the last 60 years, as we look at security, have changed quite dramatically from those days in the Cold War in particular, when our primary concern during the Cold War was a recognition of the external relationships one country had with another. How countries in Europe or Africa, Asia or Latin America got along with their neighbors was of critical importance to us, and that external context was really our primary concern, keeping peace and stability externally as the Cold War continued. But how dramatically things have changed in the last 10 years. All one has to say is Arab Spring to realize how consequentially now the internal dynamics of any country have had profound effect on U.S. foreign policy. Far more complicated, far more intricate, far more challenging. And it's that internal dynamic, as we look at national defense and security, that will continue to perplex us for a long time to come. But nonetheless, a realization of that security responsibility and the challenges related to the first D is something we need to recognize and address successfully. The second D is diplomacy. Diplomacy is required perhaps far more now in an interactive engagement than at any time in the past. Because whether or not we can deal successfully with those internal dynamics depends, of course, in part to whatever security arrangements we can create but far more on our ability to work with leaders within government, leaders both in and out of the government itself. Diplomacy has to take several tiers, and we commonly call, and the ambassador can speak to this far more eloquently and with far more experience than I can, but we commonly call second track dialogues as now an increasingly important aspect of the new diplomacy. Informal negotiations and discussions, informal talks, opportunities for students to work together, opportunities for partnerships like Georgetown and Sophia, second track dialogue and opportunities for new understanding of each other is so critical. So our second D, diplomacy, is absolutely essential if we're going to cope with the challenges as well as the opportunities as we see them unfold. The third D is development. It used to be, and oftentimes it was said, that the best social policy, at least in this country, is a good job. I would argue that perhaps the best foreign policy today is a good job. The more people are employed, the more people are financially and economically secure, the more they have an opportunity to contribute to society, the more we see the economic growth and vitality produce new environments, there is a real opportunity as well to address the challenges that we know we are destined to face. Improving lives, primarily through better educational opportunities in the developing world, can have a profound effect on the third D, and in so doing, on both security and diplomacy as well. The final D is democracy. How critical it is for people to have a voice in their own governance. How much more difficult it is to produce that opportunity to have that voice today in so many parts of the world. Tonight I'm going to another meeting as a member. I'm the vice chair of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. Madeleine Albright, who is one of your most famous professors here at Georgetown and has had a couple of other jobs, I seem to recall, in public life over the years. But she is the chair and I'm the vice chair. But the whole purpose of the organization we commonly call NDI is to help build stronger democratic institutions and to create opportunities for involvement in countries all over the world. How badly we need that now. How badly that fourth D needs to be appreciated. The sad thing today, in some respects, I say sad, is that of the 4 Ds, we spend over 4 times the amount on the first D than we do on the next 3 Ds put together. And unless we change that equation, unless we change that ratio, I don't think we can successfully address the many, many challenges we face in the future today. The success of the 4 Ds not only depends on how we change the ratio. In my view, it depends on 4 other important factors that I'd like to briefly address. The first of those 4 factors is one that I don't think gets the attention it deserves. It's the word tolerance. There is too little tolerance today. I would argue there's too little tolerance in the United States. Too little tolerance politically, ideologically, religiously. The ability to accept the fact that others can disagree is so critical to our ability to integrate this world successfully. We as a nation, and we as a partner to Japan, And we as members of a global community need so much more to appreciate and accept our ability to embrace our differences and to do so enthusiastically. But I must say, we don't have the kind of commitment to tolerance today that is so essential if we are to be successful globally in the future. The second important factor is respect for the rule of law. It doesn't matter how many laws are passed or what kind of democracy or anything else. If we can agree to a framework for governance and then ignore it and mock it, our real chances for success in global order, global stability, global development, and global governmental creation will be lost. Both international and domestic respect for the rule of law is essential. The third factor is leadership. As with other eras, leadership and the quality of leadership is so critical to whether or not we'll succeed. Public leaders committed to a better future may be one of the most important factors of all. One only has to consider the impact of our best leaders on the history and direction and ultimately the success of our country to understand the importance of good leadership. One only has to articulate a Washington, a Jefferson, a Lincoln, the Roosevelts, to understand how much one leader can make a difference. But it's certainly not just in this country. Do I have to say anything more than Nelson Mandela or Winston Churchill? Extraordinary examples of leadership at a time when we needed it the most. And what's amazing about strong leadership is not only the impact it has at the time for decisions that must be made and the need to bring countries together, but the lasting ability that they have to inspire generations of future leaders. I think I have read almost every biography of Winston Churchill that exists today, and I still am inspired by the stories of his remarkable leadership. What makes a good leader today? First, a leader must be resilient. Somebody who can realize how difficult the times may be, how able that person is to lead a country to pick themselves back up, to suffer all the indignities and all the setbacks and all of the challenges, and find ways to unify in spite of the challenges. A leader is first one who is resilient. A good leader is an innovator. Someone who isn't satisfied when somebody says we've never done it that way. Somebody who constantly thinks of new ways to do new things in public policy and beyond. A good leader is also a collaborator. One who recognizes how critical it is that we work together, who gives others credit before they give themselves whatever attention they might deserve. A good leader is one who inspires. And a good leader is one who can communicate. How badly we need good leaders today. The final factor is participation. Without it, leaders are powerless. Leaders need followers. Abraham Lincoln said a good leader is one who's always ahead of his people, but not too far ahead. Without it, cabals and narrow interests win the day without a fight. Without participation and public engagement, the global community cannot function. In the United States, our founding fathers believed deeply in those 4 factors. They believed in tolerance. They believed in the rule of law. They understood the importance of leadership. and of participation. And they applied those rules so effectively in the 18th century, just as they now apply, every bit as importantly in the 21st. There's a wonderful story that I'm sure some of you, students of history here at Georgetown, have heard about Benjamin Franklin in Constitution Hall on the second night that they were meeting. Every day a crowd would gather about the time the Constitutional Convention was about to adjourn to hear news of whatever decisions were made that day. As Franklin was walking out of the door and stood on the steps, a woman in the crowd yelled, "Mr. Franklin, have you decided our form of governance? What will it be, a monarchy or a republic?" Benjamin Franklin thought for a moment and yelled back, "Ma'am, it will be a republic if we can keep it." And as one thinks about whether it's in Japan or the United States or any other country in the world today, whether we keep it depends on one of two things: either fighting for it, as we have had to, or working at it. Or working at it. And the more we work at it, the less inclined we will need to be to fight for it. Just as Mr. Franklin would admonish us to remember how critical it is we keep it today, we also must ask ourselves, what are we doing to keep it? Not only keep it in a parochial sense, in the sense of the United States or in Japan. What are we doing to keep it globally in the 21st century? Another one of my favorite Founding Fathers stories is the one of John Adams. He was a prolific letter writer, and he wrote to his wife almost every day, Abigail. July 4th, 1774, he was sitting in a room of what we now know as our Founding Fathers. And as he was writing to Abigail, he made the observation, as I look around the room, I realize how deficient we are in education, in resources, in travel, even in intellect. But there's only us. And that is true today. There's only us. And someday, there's only you. Only you. And the only way to fulfill the promise of this extraordinarily transformational century is with the participation of the millennial generation who are willing to work at it. In this challenging world, the fulfillment, the impact on the world around us, the boldness of public service that John Kennedy inspired us to live was captured in a wonderful speech by yet another president, Teddy Roosevelt. Some of you know this quote and might even be able to repeat it verbatim. It isn't the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man, I would add today, the woman in the arena, who strives valiantly, whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood, who errs, who comes up again and again, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails while daring greatly, so that his place will never Be with those cold, timid souls who know neither victory or defeat. The global arena awaits, yearning for a new generation of leaders and participants who will truly make the difference between victory and defeat. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Senator Daschle, for that wide-ranging, inspirational talk. You've given us a lot to think about, not just this evening, but over the course of our symposium tonight and tomorrow. I'm especially delighted that you're generous enough to allow 25, 30 minutes maybe for wider conversation this evening. And as the Ambassador mentioned, that you're willing to take questions on any topic whatsoever. So this is a great opportunity, especially for our students from Georgetown and Sophia, for all those here, to pick up on themes you'd like to develop and pose questions. We have a microphone here in the middle aisle, and I'd ask you to form a line, single file behind it. If everybody introduces themselves briefly and poses a brief question, we'll have an opportunity to cover quite a lot of ground. So please take advantage of the opportunity. We've got a first question here. Please.
Thank you for coming, sir. Major Jake Turner, GPPI Army Fellow. Sir, you spoke of the importance of having a good job. And what I was wondering, sir, is if I could get your take on the raising minimum wage from $7.25 to $9 an hour. Your thoughts on that as it would help or hurt this economy?
It's a great question. I actually participated in a number of debates over the years that I've been in Congress on the very issue of raising the minimum wage. And what is very reassuring to me over the years is that study after study has demonstrated that raising the minimum wage has virtually no impact on job creation or job loss. It's fairly neutral as an influence with regard to the numbers of jobs created. But what it does do is to recognize that in many cases, the primary wage earner in a family today is a minimum wage recipient. And so I think it's very important to try to stay abreast of the cost of living challenges that a family faces today. So I would be supportive. I used to know exactly how many people who are heads of family households are on minimum wage, but it's a very significant number. I've forgotten the exact percentage. But it would be my hope that we would try to stay abreast of those extraordinary increases in costs that families have had to face. And so I would be supportive of a minimum wage increase. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, Will Riley, sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I'm just going to go ahead and out the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or 1,000-pound, or 20,000-pound, I guess. What do you think we should do on Syria? Thanks.
Well, it probably won't come as any real surprise that I support the President's efforts. This is a very, very difficult matter, and I can sympathize completely with those who are anguished about how they're going to vote. Having participated in the debates over Afghanistan and Iraq, having voted to go into Afghanistan and Iraq, I was majority leader at the time in both cases. I have great regrets about many of the decisions and the circumstances around which those decisions were made. This is a limited strike. It's a recognition that chemical warfare used, regardless of circumstance. In this case, it happens to be 1,400 people, roughly, with 400 children, cannot go without some response. I believe that not only in terms of our responsibility as the world's only superpower, do we have some important commitment in this regard that we have to demonstrate. But I worry about the message it sends if we don't act, and what it says if we continue to ignore horrific examples of inhumanity of that caliber and of that extraordinary consequence. I also worry about the image that we may send around the world if we shirk from our responsibility in an increasingly isolationist tendency. So while there is great risk involved, and while there is certainly ample room for debate and differences of opinion, I come down on the side of taking the action as the President has proposed.
My name is Tyler Bridge. I'm a freshman, and I guess on my third week here at Georgetown, I can say that I asked a question of a U.S. Senator. So,
Where are you from, Tyler?
I am from Hamilton, Ohio. It was a small Rust Belt town. All the factories just closed, actually, in January. So, you know.
So sorry to hear that.
No, it's okay. My question is different. Part of being a freshman, we have these courses called Ignatius seminars, and one of the courses is called remaking the Constitution for the 21st century. You kind of spoke about the Constitution and how it lasts today. But if you could sort of change one thing about the Constitution to make it for the 21st century, for the global era, what would you change?
For the global era. Well, first of all, I would say I'm a minimalist when it comes to constitutional law. I don't believe that the Constitution should be very detailed. I think it has to be able to adapt to circumstances about which we can't really fully anticipate as we look to the future. And so the more we can keep the framework simple, the better. I think probably the most intriguing challenge we face today with regard to international commitment constitutionally is what is the role of the President and what is the role of Congress with regard to engagement, to decisions about conflict. We passed about 40 years ago the War Powers Act to try to articulate and to a certain extent define what those roles are. But obviously we haven't done a very good job. It's been a long, long time. World War II was the last decision we made to declare war. And so we've had resolutions authorizing conflict, the Gulf of Tonkin, in one, the Iraqi resolution, two, Afghanistan, and now, of course, another. But there is a constant friction and tension between Congress and the President. If somehow that could be further clarified, I think we'd be doing real justice.
Hi, Senator. I'm Alex Garber. I'm a sophomore in the college. And you were a major factor and a positive influence on President Obama when he was a senator and as he was deciding to run for president. You might have actually been one of the people who pushed him to run for president. What about him, what characteristics about him made you think that he was such a great leader? And do you think that he lives up to your definition of a leader that you gave today?
It's a great question. The answer to the second part of your question is absolutely. I'm very proud of the leadership he's provided our country at a very, very difficult time. I would say my illustrations of leadership go back to the economic crisis that we faced in 2009, just after he became president. We'll never fully appreciate the magnitude of how deep that crisis was and how close we were to economic collapse and catastrophe. We avoided it in part, and only in part, but certainly a very big part, as a result of his leadership. My personal favorite, of course, is healthcare and the extraordinary realization that for the first time in history, in the history of our country, we'll have an opportunity to begin to create a system within our country that allows for universal coverage of healthcare for all Americans. So I'm very excited about that. I would also say internationally, our image abroad was tarnished and challenged, to say the least, in the first decade of the 21st century. And I think to a certain extent, he's been successful in restoring some of that image. So the qualities that I saw in the president, first and foremost, was that he was such a good listener. I love the quote attributed to Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State for President Kennedy, who once said, "The best way to persuade is with your ears." And I believe that. I think the best way to persuade is by being a good listener. And President Obama is a very good listener. I also think that it's enormously important that a man of color is now the President of the United States for the first time in history. And the message it sends to other parts of the world about diversity, about tolerance, about the extraordinary uniqueness of the American experiment is in and of itself something worth a lot to our country and to society today. Thank you. Good question.
Hi there, Senator Daschle. My name is Roe Haydar. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service, and I know you mentioned in your speech that the best foreign policy and the best domestic policy, for that matter, is a good job. And I know we have a lot of foreign policy issues at hand, but once the domestic policy issues come back into focus, it seems like there's a lot of the discussion about that is centered on cutting the deficit via austerity measures and like cutting back instead of spending more. And I wonder why, if you think there's a reason as to why both Democrats and Republicans alike have been focusing on cutting the deficit rather than investing in more programs and expanding government to stimulate the economy and create more jobs.
Well, I think your question is such a valid one today, and I struggle to come up with a good answer to how it is we find ourselves in the situation we have today. You know, we spent over $2 trillion on 2 wars. We spent another $2 trillion on tax cuts in the early part of the last decade. We lost $6 trillion with the economic recession we've experienced through the beginning in 2008. That has led to a deficit overall of about $17 trillion. Virtually the highest deficit and debt that we've experienced, not deficit any longer, but debt that we've experienced since the last World War. That has led a lot of people to be concerned about the chasm between spending and revenue. We're at 22% spending, a percent of GDP, 22%. We're at 16% revenue. So there's roughly a 6% chasm between revenue and spending that has to be addressed. Now, we've actually come up with a $4 trillion deficit reduction package. Unfortunately, $1 trillion of that is in discretionary spending. The least impactful in terms of real debt reduction, but the most impactful in terms of job creation and economic development. And so it has been a tragedy in some ways that we put so much emphasis on the spending side for discretionary accounts when the real effort should be made on the entitlement side to redesign our programs to work more effectively and to save resources. And we can do that, especially in healthcare, but across the board. And so, but unfortunately, there's an ideological debate in this country about the role of government that will continue for a long time to come. And because that ideological debate has now been focused largely on how we reduce the debt, many Republican members of Congress have argued that they're not in favor of raising one more dollar beyond that 16% of revenue as part of the GDP. They want us to bring 22% down to 16%, which would be an all-time historic low for a commitment to public investments we've made in our country. So many of us believe that what we need to do is to raise revenue 3% and to reduce spending 3% and come at around about a 19% balance. And I think just as we've done historically, unfortunately that isn't likely in the short term. That's a long answer to a good question, but that's where we are today.
Thanks, Senator, and thank you again for coming.
My pleasure.
Hello, Senator. Thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm a freshman here, and I want to study U.S.-Asian relations. And I have a question about the theme of service in the speech, particularly something you said, commitment to public service may not be what it used to be because of we're limiting the size of government and a decrease in the U.S. role abroad. I guess my question is how you came to that conclusion and just how you would respond to the idea that as we decrease government's role, does that not increase the private sector and individuals who want to step up and become men and women for others?
Absolutely. In answer to the first part of your question, all one has to do is to look at the budgets today and also, interestingly, the degree to which people are seeking jobs in some of these particular programs, like the Peace Corps. We're not getting anywhere near the robust interest in volunteerism as we've had in the past. And so the numbers are down historically since the program started. But they're down also as a direct result of fairly dramatic cuts in the availability of resources for many of these programs. So the combination of reductions in budget and the reductions generally in interest in serving in these programs has led me to believe that we've got to be concerned about those trends over the long term. Now, in answer to the second part of your question, absolutely. As I mentioned, and I would certainly emphasize, I think the private sector has a tremendous role to play. And many of us believe that there's an even more exciting role, perhaps, in public-private partnerships in a lot of countries abroad, where public and private institutions and entities can work in a much more closely integrated way to bring about new organizational responses to many of the challenges we face. But at the end of the day, in my view, a framework for governance is almost essential to addressing many of the challenges, whether it's climate change or how we address nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. That can't be addressed singularly in the private sector. It takes some sort of a governmental framework within which to do so successfully. So, is there more opportunity in the private sector? Absolutely. But should we be encouraging public service and public commitment to community? Absolutely as well. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sophie, and I'm a freshman in the SFS. And as a student, I've experienced the great influence that my teachers have had and that education has had on my perception of the world. And so my question for you is, what do you think are the most important and most effective ways that we, as students, as citizens, and as American citizens, can do to improve education nationally and globally?
I think the most important thing begins all the way back at the earliest stages of life, making absolutely certain that children have good nutrition, that children have opportunities to learn. My teacher, Sister Morris, somebody that I mentioned in my remarks, made an interesting observation. She said, my job as a teacher is to light the curiosity candle in every one of my students. And I've always loved that notion. To what extent can teachers light the curiosity candle? Because once you light that candle, if it stays lit, you remain a student for the rest of your life. The most curious people are the best students, but they're also the best leaders and citizens. They're curious about things. They reach out. They want to learn. So we need to teach curiosity. But in order to be a good student, you have to be a healthy student. You have to have good nutrition and good health. And so I think first and foremost, it's really critical that we give everybody the start they need in life to ensure that they can be curious people as they get older.
If you don't mind, I have a second question.
Sure.
What motivates you?
What motivates me?
Yeah, you talked about what motivates your brother, but what motivates you specifically?
Well, I have 3 children, and all through my life and their lives, I've tried to encourage them to do 2 things initially, and a third thing I've added in the last 10 years. The first thing I encourage them to do is to follow their bliss. By that I mean follow your passion, whatever your passion is. My early passion was to be in public service. My early passion was to be a part of democracy and to live it as much as I could every day. And I am living my passion. You know, I lived it in elective politics for a long period of time, for close to 30 years. And now I live it outside of elective politics, but I stay involved because it's my passion. It's my bliss. The second is to give back, to find ways to give back. And each one of them, to their credit and to my pride, have done so. The third admonition I've had for them is to remind them the most important title they'll ever have in life is that of parent, and to be a good parent. And they've been fantastic parents so far to our 4 grandchildren. But I find an enormous amount of bliss and fulfillment staying involved in public policy and public life. Thank
so
you.
much.
So I'm confident we will have time to get through the line, but I'd ask that we maybe take 2 questions at a time, given the time constraints.
Let's do that.
To get all the way through. Please.
Hello, my name is Patrick. I'm a freshman here. I'm also from Minnesota, so I think we have some common roots.
Whereabouts in Minnesota?
In Orono, a little bit outside of Minneapolis,
Okay.
about 30 minutes.
Great. I get to Rochester quite frequently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So it's a ways away from, it's about 40 minutes from where I live.
Yeah.
But my question was, the president, when he had his press conference about Syria, he claimed that he had the power without congressional approval to strike Syria. Do you believe that as the, you talked about it earlier, that you would like to clear things up, but do you believe as the Constitution stands now that he has the authority to do that without congressional approval?
Okay. Second question.
Hi, my name is Andrew Meshnick. I'm a freshman in the college here from Massachusetts. And my question was, how would you touched on how we have to work at keeping our democracy and our republic. How would you increase our dismal rates of participation in the political process, where in local elections, if you hit 5%, that's a great turnout. How would you increase that so that people feel that they have a stake in it and they don't throw up their hands in cynicism and say that we can't do anything about it?
That's a great question, too. The answer to your first question, I would say, I don't think there's any question the president has the authority. Many presidents have used that authority over time. President Clinton did on a couple of occasions, Somalia, Bosnia. Virtually every president at some point has found the need. President Reagan in Grenada, just a number of occasions over time. In fact, the War Powers Act authorizes the president to use force for 60 days without congressional approval, but then requires them to come back after 60 days. In answer to the question of participation and involvement, number one, I'm dumbfounded, frankly, by some of the state legislatures who have tried to make it more difficult for people to vote over the last 6 months. I'm just flabbergasted that we would do that. There is virtually zero evidence of fraud in voting today. But I think the way to make it more participatory is to move Election Day to a Saturday or a Sunday, so people don't have to worry about taking off work or getting in line or waiting 6 or 7 hours and not having the ability to work or leaving their families at home. I would have early voting. I would have, Oregon is one state. I think there are others, but Oregon for sure has strictly mail-in votes where they do all voting by mail. I think that's also had profound consequences with regard to participation. So there are a lot of things we can do, but requiring people to have a driver's license or a photo identification when up to 30% of the people in this country, especially older people like my mother, or poor people without cars or without much reason to have a driver's license or some form of ID, are increasingly locked out of the process in part because of these obstacles put in the way of voters today, and we've got to turn that around. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Daschle, for being here. My name's Alex. I'm a freshman in the college, and I do a lot of campaign work, and something I've really noticed is like online campaigning, the level of civility in some ways and has totally collapsed online with, anonymous people who just will say anything. I was just kind of wondering in general how we can hold people accountable in a way for the level of their discourse when it comes to political disagreement?
Well, that's really a tough question because the First Amendment is pretty clear with regard to one's right to express oneself, and so we will always face that. I only take solace in knowing that it has always been. One has to have a thick skin and be able to suffer the arrows of rhetorical opposition in many forms. But it's part of the political process that I'm least proud of and troubled by oftentimes. But I really don't know. What concerns me even more than the level of rhetoric, and I couldn't agree more with you about how problematic some of the blogs and the extraordinarily harsh rhetoric and the tone of many of the campaign assertions are today. But what bothers me even more is the amount of money and how much money goes into these campaigns today and how prohibitive it is for a lot of people of limited means to be able to run for public office. My first race for the Congress cost around $350,000. My last race for the Senate cost $25 million. And that's a bargain compared to the $40 million races that were spent, experienced in both Massachusetts and Virginia in the last election. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't take two questions. We'll take two this time.
Senator Daschle, thank you for your time. My name is Kobe Saul. I'm a native South Dakota.
Oh, really? Where?
Redfield.
Redfield, 40 miles from my hometown of Aberdeen.
That's correct.
That is correct, right?
I'm a staff member here at Georgetown Medical Center. My question had already been answered at the time, so I just wanted to thank you for inspiring my native South Dakotans and entering public service. And, you're an inspiration for me in some of the same ways that President Kennedy was for me. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you. Maybe we'll take two more questions.
Well, first, thank you very much for being here, Senator. My question is really two parts. Being at this school as future global leaders, or we would hope, what advice would you have for us, seeing as so much of the world is really fettered in oppression and lacking democratic rule of law? What would your advice be for getting involved, or for those of us considering careers in public service, on unifying the countries of the world in support of democracy and economic freedom? And my second part of the question would be, what do you foresee the U.S.'s role going forward in the 21st century in supporting that mission?
Okay. Second question.
My name is Julian. I'm from Maryland, and I'm a student at this university. I'm kind of the one thing I wanted to wonder about was the mass media and entertainment. I'm kind of concerned of the lots of unhealthy depictions of unhealthy behavior, graphic violence, or pornography, or drug usage, or profanity. I was wondering if any of this can be of a major concern, how it may affect our world.
Okay, thank you. Let me take the first questions first. Advice. My hope for each of you is that you'll keep your ideological and your optimistic hopes alive. I mean, I don't ever become cynical. President Obama is one of the most optimistic people I know. And he reminds me of what George Shaw said first and what Robert Kennedy used to use often as his closing statement in a speech, that many people see things as they are and ask why, and others dream of things as they might be and ask why not. In the 21st century, there's so many reasons to ask why not, to be excited and to have real confidence that you can make a difference. And so that would be my strongest advice, is to hold on to that real belief that you can make a difference, you can make an impact, you can change things. And I hope you'll do that in spite of all the reasons for cynicism and for pessimism today. Our U.S. role continues to change. Obviously, we're always going to be a strong nation militarily, but I think our role and responsibility is so much more complex than just military strength. And as I was talking about my 4 Ds, that would be my hope, is that we could obviously keep in mind our unique role in creating security worldwide, and certainly the debate involving Syria is one illustration of that. But it's those other 3 Ds that I hope we'll spend more time thinking about and doing something about. I hope we'll become more engaged diplomatically at all levels, far more engaged in creating jobs all over the world, and far more committed to giving people a voice in their own governance. That, to me, is the most important responsibility for our country as we look to the future. With regard to the violence and the quality of entertainment today on the many different avenues for entertainment that we have today, in this country, it's the First Amendment that allows people to demonstrate their preferences. I think television is too violent. I think it's unfortunate. I do think that to a certain extent it triggers violence. Although I would add that many other countries have the same access to those violent television shows and don't have anywhere close to the violence we have in this country. So it isn't just the entertainment that triggers that violence. I think it's easy access to guns and weapons of just enormous and devastating impact and power, as we've seen on so many occasions in the last several years in our country today. But I share your frustration and your concern about entertainment today, and I think we need to do a better job of discouraging it, even though I don't think there's anything we can do to outlaw it.
Senator Daschle, thank you very much again for coming today. My name is Mason Hill. I'm a freshman in the SFS, and I'm originally from Kentucky. I guess my question is, do you think if about 10 years ago or so, when the Rome Statute and the ICC was before the Congress for ratification, do you think if that had been ratified and the United States was a member of the ICC, there would be more options in Syria to bring President Assad to justice without a military intervention? And if so, do you think that the situation in Syria will make any difference on the debate of whether or not the U.S. should join the ICC?
Well, that's a fantastic question. If you haven't read Tom Friedman in recent weeks, you should. I'd encourage you. Tom Friedman, the columnist in the New York Times, but he makes that point, that we really ought to shame Assad much more. And you're absolutely right. I regret that we're not part of every world organization. And we could have used those tools so much more effectively had we been part. The Law of the Sea is another clear example of what a disappointment it is that we're not fully engaged participants and partners. But it could have made a difference. It still could make a difference. And that is yet another option that we should consider embracing a lot more aggressively and a lot more routinely than we do today. Last 2 questions.
Thank you. I'm from Sophia University. I'm sophomore. My name is Chikamasa Wakabayashi. I have one question about Syria and about U.S. and Japan alliance. If U.S. goes intervene to Syria, I think that Japan have to go with the same way. And if Japan have to go the same way, I think that we have to change. We have to inform the constitution. And if the Japanese politician change, or not change, but inform the constitution, what do you think would happen? And what do you think about it?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for asking the question. Second question.
Hello, Senator. I'm Mina Ikari. I'm from Sophia University in Tokyo. I major in law and I'm a junior. the two gentlemen before me asked fully my question, so I would like to thank you for answering your question. And also, I found that there's a struggle for the United States as a leader in the globalized world. And as you said, I think, I believe democracy should be more worldwide, but it isn't. And I thought, what is the big struggle for the U.S. as a global leader? And I would like to know what allies like Japan could do to help the United States. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm delighted, and how wonderful it is that our last two questions were from students from Sophia, so thank you. And again, to each of the students from Sophia, thank you so much for being a part of this program. I'm certainly not an expert on the Japanese Constitution, but I think it's fair to say that the President in the United States is really not looking for military engagement from our allies and friends, as much as we are looking for support publicly, support articulated by leadership like President Abe did just a few days ago. That kind of commitment and that kind of show of support and show of solidarity with the United States, I think, is exactly what the President is looking for from other countries as well. And because it is not a requirement for further military commitment, I think the limits within your Constitution regarding military engagement would probably not be affected, at least by the Syrian matter. And I think it's very meaningful for the United States to have the support of Japan in that regard. With regard to, I'm struggling now to remember the second question. The degree to which other countries can help the United States, I think I go back, if I could use my framework again. We need help, not so much in terms of security, even though there are times when security is critical, but certainly to the extent that Japan and the United States can work in partnership to create jobs in the developing world, the more we can create more democratic institutional strength, the more we can do more in creating better diplomatic ties, especially using second-track approaches, unofficial approaches, the more we're going to create the kind of integrated, tolerant world that is so critical to both Japan and the United States today. So it's critical, it seems to me, that we look at this 4D framework from both the perspective of Japan and the United States as a strategy for engaging the world in the 21st century in a very effective way. I hope our leadership will keep that in mind, and I'm confident that they will. I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to be with you. Thank you.